Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a philosophical detective story.
I like that. A detective story.
We're not just summarizing a great work. We are going backstage. We're looking at the drafts, the delays, and, the frantic late-night revisions of one of the most meticulous thinkers in history, Immanuel Kant.
It's funny you say meticulous because what we're about to unpack is actually kind of a mess.
That's the story, isn't it?
It is. Kant's critique of judgment, which is the third pillar of his entire critical system, it presents itself with this just intimidating logical precision.
Like a finished cathedral.
Exactly. But our sources, they let us see the messy, real-time process of its creation. We are charting, and this is a great phrase, the last stages of the development of Kant's critique of taste.
And our mission here is really driven by a question from you, our listener, a learner who wants to know not just the final product, but the path. How did he get there?
So we're doing intellectual archaeology.
Totally. We're looking for the textual evidence, the weird delays, the conceptual breakthroughs that forced Kant to transform what he thought would be a simple critique of taste into this monumental bridge between his theoretical and his practical philosophies.
And this is where the mystery really deepens. We are going to explore a really radical hypothesis about the book's most famous section, the Analytic of the Beautiful.
Yes, the four moments.
The beautiful four-part structure that, every philosophy student has to memorize. We're going to argue that this structure might have been a systematic afterthought.
An afterthought? You mean he just sort of slapped it on at the end?
Slapped it on is maybe a bit strong, but imposed upon the material late in the game to make sure the structure fit the rest of his intellectual architecture.
So was that elegant structure an organic revelation that came out of the material itself? Or was it more like a brilliantly effective but, conceptually messy filing system?
That is the question. And to answer it, we have to start at the very beginning, tracing Kant's intellectual history with aesthetics long before the critical project swallowed it whole.
Okay, let's dig in.
So it's really important to establish that Kant's interest in aesthetics was deep and long-standing.
This wasn't just him checking a box on his philosophical to-do list.
Not at all. Our sources stress that his engagement was immediate and independent. He had a genuine early enthusiasm for this topic.
And we have proof of that, right?
Yeah.
Going way back.
We do. We see clear evidence dating all the way back to 1764. That's more than 2 decades before the Critique of Judgment was published.
Wow, okay.
He wrote an essay called Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime. And this early work is crucial because it shows us Kant's baseline perspective on beauty before all the heavy lifting of transcendental philosophy began.
What did that baseline look like? What stands out about it?
What stands out most about that 1764 essay is its distinctly anthropological standpoint.
Anthropological.
Yeah.
So less abstract philosophy, more observing people.
Exactly. He wasn't looking for universal, mind-independent laws of beauty. He was observing human psychology and culture. It's almost like empirical sociology.
That's fascinating. Tell us a bit more about the structure of that early essay, because I get the feeling it's going to contrast pretty heavily with the rigid structure we find in 1790.
Oh, it's a world away. The 1764 essay had 4 sections, and they're all focused entirely on human experience.
Okay, what were they?
First, he discussed the different objects that tend to evoke the feeling of the beautiful and the sublime. Then second, the qualities of the sublime and beautiful in man, generally so, like what types of people are beautiful or sublime.
He's categorizing people.
He is. Third, he gets into the differences in feeling related to the sexes, which is a very, let's be generous and say, Enlightenment-era analysis.
Right. Of its time.
Very much of its time. And finally, he looks at national characteristics in relation to these feelings. So how different cultures experience beauty.
So he's cataloging how different groups experience these feelings. That is the definition of empirical observation.
It is.
It's a million miles away from the transcendental method he later perfected, which, is all about searching for the necessary conditions for any experience whatsoever.
A million miles. And speaking of observation, we also have to talk about Kant's personal context here.
Right. What was his own taste like?
Well, while he was keenly interested in the subject, our sources clarify that his personal knowledge and appreciation of actual fine art were remarkably limited.
He wasn't exactly a museum goer or an opera buff, was he?
No, not at all. His appreciation was, and this is a quote, almost entirely confined to literature. He was a dedicated self-taught reader.
So if we want to understand Kant's own aesthetic world, we shouldn't look at paintings. We should look at his bookshelf.
Precisely. And on that bookshelf, you'd find a lot of English poets. Specifically, he was drawn to Pope, Milton, and Young.
That feels like a really critical detail. He's analyzing the experience of beauty primarily through texts, which are structured, linear, often argument-driven forms. That's so different from the fluid, immediate, and often abstract nature of, say, visual art or music.
That's an excellent point. It really does suggest that when the time came for him to systematize aesthetics,
The impulse to order everything into a neat, argumentative structure, like a literary critique,
yeah,
was already kind of hardwired into him.
it was his default mode.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is that this literary focus didn't initially push him towards finding a priori rules. For a long, long time, Kant was firmly committed to the absolute opposite.
And this is what I find the most surprising part of the whole story.
Yeah.
This is the man who defined modern philosophy by establishing the necessary universal and a priori conditions for everything, for knowledge, for morality.
Yeah.
How could he possibly treat aesthetics as just observational for so long?
Well into his maturity, Kant regarded taste as a subject that could only be treated empirically, and we have concrete proof of this. In the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, he takes aim directly at the German philosopher Alexander Baumgarten.
Okay, so for listeners who might not remember, Baumgarten was the one who basically coined the term aesthetics, right?
He did, and he tried to turn the study of sensory experience and beauty into a rational, systematic discipline.
And Kant was not a fan.
Kant was not having it. He specifically objected to Baumgarten's use of aesthetics to mean critique of taste. He argued that Baumgarten's whole effort to subject the criticism of the beautiful to principles of reason and to elevate its rules into a science was fundamentally misplaced.
What did he call it?
He called it a disappointed hope.
A disappointed hope. That is powerful language. Why was he so aggressively dismissive of the whole idea?
He was convinced that the rules or criteria of taste are, in respect to their sources, merely empirical, and because they're empirical, they could never serve as laws a priori.
So there's no universal law that says this is beautiful.
Not according to the Kant of 1781. He asserted that it's our judgment, our actual experience of taste, that forms the proper test of correctness. Taste is the measure, not the thing being measured.
So his thinking back then was, you can't logically argue someone into finding a sunset beautiful. You just observe whether they do or they don't.
Exactly.
And that leaves absolutely no room for the necessary universal claim that is the hallmark of his entire critical system.
Precisely. And if he had stopped there, the critique of judgment would never have existed. It's what makes the textual evidence of his turning point so absolutely crucial.
So let's get to that. This shift happens between the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 and the second edition, which came out in April 1787. And in that new edition, Kant subtly qualifies that really harsh statement about aesthetics being purely empirical.
This is where the philosophical archaeology really pays off. It's not a big, flashy change. Kant inserted two small but devastatingly important words.
What were they?
He put the word chief before sources and determinate before laws.
Okay, let's pause and really analyze those two words because it sounds like they changed everything.
They did.
The original statement said that the rules were empirical in respect to their sources and could never serve as laws a priori.
Now, with the additions, the criteria of taste are empirical in respect to their chief sources.
Chief sources.
Yeah.
Which immediately implies that there must be non-chief sources.
Exactly. Other sources that are not empirical. And those non-chief sources would be what allows for an a priori element to creep in.
Okay, and what about the second word, determinate? If the rules can't serve as determinate laws a priori.
It implies that they might be able to serve as non-determinate or maybe regulative laws a priori.
Ah, and this is the genius of the shift. So a determinate law is a hard and fast rule.
Right, like a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. If aesthetics were governed by determinate laws, we could define beauty with a formula.
Which Kant knew we couldn't do.
Correct. But a regulative principle is different. It's a rule that organizes our experience, but it doesn't define the objects themselves.
So by inserting chief and determinate, Kant was basically cracking open a door. He was acknowledging that while the primary experience of taste is sensory and subjective, the empirical, the chief sources. The structure of our mind when we make that judgment might still follow universal necessary rules.
Yes. Rules that serve to regulate or guide our search for harmony rather than determine an object's beauty, absolutely.
This quiet linguistic move in 1787 is the textual turning point. It's the signal that Kant had found his loophole.
He found the loophole. He had realized that aesthetic judgment wasn't about the object at all. It was about the internal relationship of the judging faculties inside our own minds.
And that realization immediately demanded a third critique.
It did. And once that door was open, the project just exploded, setting off this frantic, systematic work that consumed the next 3 years of his life.
Okay, so the moment Kant recognized this possibility of a priori principles for taste, he just jumps right into systematic development.
He does. But the process was anything but smooth. Our sources lay out a really clear timeline of publication delay from 1787 to 1790.
His initial enthusiasm was huge, though,
It's
right?
enormous. By June of 1787, Kant wrote to his correspondent, Schütz, that he intended to proceed at once to consider the fundamental principles of the critique of taste. He really thought he had the conceptual groundwork covered.
And just 6 months later, in December 1787, he wrote that famous letter to Reinhold.
Yes, announcing that the work, which he was still calling the Critique of Taste, was already in manuscript.
And he thought it would be published by the next Easter in 1788.
He was very optimistic, but Easter 1788 came and went, and then the next deadline passed.
It's starting to sound familiar.
And by May 1789, a full year after it was supposedly completed, the title itself had changed. And that tells you everything.
What was the new title?
He now referred to it as the Critique of Judgment, of which the Critique of Taste forms part.
Wow. Of which the Critique of Taste forms part. So the original book has now become just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
It has. That title change and the 3-year delay between a seemingly complete manuscript and the final publication, it just screams of massive internal reorganization and conceptual struggle.
So what was driving this huge expansion?
It wasn't simple procrastination. It was a profound, systematic breakthrough, driven by what Kant described as an inward conviction.
An inward conviction.
In that December 1787 letter, he notes that the further he proceeded, the less he feared modifying his system. He said he was getting new light by looking back at his entire philosophical framework, his general list of the elements of knowledge and of the faculties of mind.
He wasn't just writing another book. He was completing his philosophical universe. This led him to this big discovery about the tripartite mind.
Precisely. Kant realized his whole critical project, which was meant to define the scope and limits of human knowledge, was structurally incomplete. He had a two-legged stool.
Right.
He identified 3 distinct, irreducible faculties of the mind, and each one required its own critical foundation.
And we know the first two very well. There's the faculty of knowledge, which is about how we understand the world. That's the critique of pure reason.
Correct.
And then there's the will, which is how we act morally. And that's the critique of practical reason.
Exactly. So what's the missing piece? The gaping hole was the third faculty, the one that mediates between the other two. The feeling of pleasure and pain.
How does that fit in? How does pleasure and pain connect knowledge and morality?
Well, think about it. The first critique establishes the realm of nature, where everything is causally determined. The second critique establishes the realm of freedom, where we must act as if we are free.
And those two realms seem completely distinct. Opposed, even.
They do. So the mind, which somehow houses both nature and freedom, needs a mechanism to connect them. It needs a bridge.
And that bridge is the feeling of pleasure or pain.
Right. Kant realized that this feeling is what connects our theoretical knowledge to our practical action. We feel pleasure when we recognize the world of nature harmonizing with the requirements of our mind. We feel displeasure when that harmony is missing.
So his search for a priori principles that could govern pleasure and pain, that's what put him on the right track to complete his whole system.
It's what allowed him to define 3 parts of philosophy. Theoretical philosophy, which is knowledge, practical philosophy, which is the will, and this third part, which he started calling teleology.
Teleology.
Yeah.
Purpose. Why did he see purpose or finality as the missing link?
Because the feeling of pleasure, at least in the aesthetic sense, is tied directly to recognizing finality in an object.
What do you mean by that?
It looks as if it were designed for a purpose, even if we can't actually name that purpose. You see a beautiful flower and it just seems
Why?
Harmonious.
As if it were made to be seen.
Exactly. And this recognition of purpose, or teleology, in nature is precisely what helps the theoretical faculty, which deals with nature, connect to the practical faculty, which deals with freedom and morality.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. So an aesthetic judgment allows us to look at a beautiful object in nature and feel a sense of harmonious design, which in turn makes us more receptive to the idea of a moral, purposeful order in the universe, an idea that's necessary for the practical moral sphere.
You've got it. And that connection is what drove the expansion from the narrow critique of taste to the much broader critique of judgment.
And to make that work, he had to make a really crucial distinction about the faculty of judgment itself.
Yes, the work now had to distinguish between two types of judgment: reflective judgment and determinate judgment.
Okay, break that down for us. What's determinate judgment?
Determinate judgment is what science uses. You have the universal rule, like gravity, and you apply it to a particular instance, like this falling apple. You determine the particular by using the universal.
You're fitting the data to the existing law.
Right. But reflective judgment goes the other way. You're presented with a particular object, a beautiful flower, for instance, and you have to reflect upon it to find a universal rule or principle that might apply.
You're starting with the data and searching for a law.
You are. And aesthetic judgment is inherently reflective. When we call something beautiful, we're trying to find a universal principle to justify our personal feeling of pleasure, even though we can't actually identify that principle with a concept.
So the big delay happened because Kant realized he wasn't just dealing with taste anymore. He was dealing with the fundamental structure of the entire reflective faculty, which governs both beauty and how we see purpose in nature.
The aesthetic judgment was just the starting point. But even with this huge expansion, he did come back to the aesthetic core in his preface. He offers the solution to why the critique of taste was the necessary lever for the whole thing.
And what was that solution?
He regarded it as the one essential portion of a critique of judgment.
The essential portion. Why?
Because, as he states, it is only in respect of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure that the faculty of judgment contains a principle that is constitutive a priori.
What does constitutive mean here?
It means it actually defines how the mind must operate. Aesthetic judgment is the only place where the reflective faculty yields a necessary universal principle, the necessity of harmony between our cognitive powers that constitutes a rule for the mind itself.
Wow. So our judgment about nature's purpose only gives us regulative principles, guidelines for understanding.
Right.
But our judgment of beauty gives us a constitutive principle about the human mind. That's what grounded the entire third pillar.
That's what grounded it. The 3-year delay was him frantically trying to elaborate the second part, the teleological part, and integrate it with the aesthetic insights he already had. He had the conceptual engine, which was taste, but he struggled immensely to design the full systemic architecture to house it.
Now that we understand the pressure he was under to complete that architecture, let's look inside the most famous section, the Analytic of the Beautiful, to find the internal evidence of that struggle.
Okay, now we're in the detective phase. We're looking for the textual clues, the fingerprints that betray the chronological development of the text.
We're dusting for prints.
We are. Because when you study Kant, you encounter the Analytic of the Beautiful as this perfect monolithic structure. But our sources suggest it was patched together.
So first, let's establish what must have been in that original, simpler manuscript, the critique of taste that he thought was ready back in 1787.
That draft almost certainly contained the core aesthetic concepts. The breakthrough was already there. The idea that beauty depends on the representation of finality apart from an end.
That's the philosophical nucleus of the whole theory.
It is, and the key paradoxes were also present. The peculiar universality and necessity of the judgment of taste. How can something be subjective but also demand universal agreement?
I would guess the treatment of the sublime was also there, given his early interest back in '64.
Absolutely. The treatment of the sublime was almost certainly included, and it likely underwent very slight alteration compared to what happened to the Analytic of the Beautiful.
And that's a clue in itself, right?
Yeah.
It's a critical clue. The analysis of the sublime is described as being very much more psychological and less critical than the Analytic of the Beautiful.
So the fact that the section on the sublime is less rigidly structured, more observational, suggests that the original treatment of beauty might have been similarly free-flowing before Kant forced it into this tight, critical mold.
Exactly. We also know that for it to be a full critique, the work must have included a formal deduction.
Which is this section that justifies the a priori claim.
and an antinomy of taste, which resolves the seeming contradiction between taste being subjective but also claiming to be universal. These structural components were necessary from the very start.
Okay, so if the core insights, finality, universality, necessity, and the structural parts, the deduction, the antinomy, were already there, what was the missing piece? What forced the remodeling?
That missing piece was the intense pressure to integrate the aesthetic judgment perfectly into his systematic philosophy, especially with the moral faculty. This brings us to the really radical proposition.
The hypothesis.
The hypothesis that the four moments were a late insertion.
Okay, so let's just quickly review that famous structure. The analytic of the beautiful is divided into four moments, which Kant deliberately and meticulously maps onto the four classes of categories from the Critique of Pure Reason.
Quality, quantity, relation, and modality. This mapping is the key to the structure's perceived elegance.
So the first moment, which is quality, is about the disinterestedness of our satisfaction.
Right. The second moment, quantity, is about universality without a concept.
The third moment, relation, is that core idea of finality apart from an end.
And the fourth moment, modality, is the necessity of the judgment, but a necessity without a rule.
And the theory is that this four-part structure was imposed after he already had these individual concepts worked out. So what was the motive? Why remodel it this way?
The motive was pure structural necessity. It's what we're calling the moral link. As Kant realized, the Critique of Judgment had to furnish a seamless transition from the theoretical to the practical sphere.
From nature to freedom.
From nature to freedom, he needed a perfect systematic analogy. He needed to show that the aesthetic judgment mirrored the structure of the moral judgment to prove the unity of reason.
And to make that analogy crystal clear, he had to force his aesthetic analysis to map perfectly onto the table of categories, which had already defined both his theoretical and his practical philosophy.
It had to fit. And the crucial conceptual step that allowed him to use that table was recognizing disinterestedness as the first moment.
Why was that one so important?
Because disinterestedness means the judgment is free from any material interest or desire. It aligns perfectly with the category of quality, which often relates to negation or limitation, in this case, the removal of desire.
But more importantly,
it's the precondition for moral judgment, which must also be disinterested. By putting disinterestedness first, Kant established the intellectual lever that linked aesthetics structurally to morality.
so once that anchor was set, the other core insights he already had, universality, finality, necessity, could just be slotted into the remaining three categories.
Right. Universality fits quantity, finality fits relation, and necessity fits modality. And suddenly you have this highly satisfying, systematic correspondence that Kant just cherished.
It was a beautiful piece of architectural engineering.
It was, but like any structure that's rushed to completion, it left behind internal inconsistencies. And this is where we can find the evidence supporting the afterthought claim. We can see the cracks in the walls.
Okay, let's go through the 5 major pieces of textual evidence that our sources highlight. What's the first one?
Inconsistency number 1, disregard for earlier discussion. So you get to the deduction in section 31, and Kant opens by stating that the judgment of taste has a double and, in fact, logical peculiarity, a peculiar universality and necessity. And then he begins the huge task of proving those 2 points.
But wait a second. Universality and necessity, aren't those the second and fourth moments?
They are.
He just spent the entire analytic establishing and discussing them in detail. Why on earth would he announce them again in the deduction as if they're brand new, unproven concepts?
This is the massive anomaly. It strongly suggests that the discussion in the deduction, which focuses only on those 2 logical peculiarities, predates the formal 4-moment structure.
So in the original, simpler draft, he probably had a brief analytic that introduced finality, and then he jumped right to the deduction to justify the universality and necessity claims.
That's the theory. And when he imposed the 4 moments, he moved the discussions of universality and necessity into the analytic for that structural neatness, but he forgot to remove or significantly revise the original deduction text.
Which brings us directly to the second inconsistency, which is probably the most frustrating one for any modern reader of this text.
It really is. Inconsistency number 2, repetition and surcharge. The work contains just an unusual amount of repetition, and it's almost entirely centered on the contents of the second and fourth moments, universality and necessity.
You're reading the same ground being covered twice, once in the analytic to fit the category structure, and then again in the deduction, because that section used to be the sole location of the proof.
The entire argument in the deduction, from section 31 to 38, is deemed by many critics to be mere repetition of points he already covered. In his systemic fervor, Kant failed to see that integrating these proofs into the four-moment structure had made the subsequent separate deduction redundant.
The scaffolding was left up after the building was finished.
Perfectly put.
Okay, the third inconsistency. This one gives us a fascinating, very human glimpse into the frantic nature of this whole remodeling effort.
It does. Inconsistency number 3, the deleted heading. When the work was finalized and sent off to the printer, section 30 was headed Third Book, Deduction of Aesthetic Judgments.
Third book. That's a huge structural commitment. It suggests a major independent part of the work.
It does. But at the very last moment, I mean literally as the presses are about to roll, Kant ordered the heading Third Book to be struck out.
No way.
And this change was so last minute, it only appears in the errata section of the first edition.
Just imagine that scene. The master philosopher, the man known for his methodical consistency, is frantically sending a note to the printers to change a major organizational label.
It highly suggests he had a sudden, profound realization, probably while reviewing the final proofs. He realized the exposition, the moments, had already absorbed the essential work of the deduction.
So he tried to minimize the structural importance of the deduction section because he knew it was now largely redundant.
But he was too late to fully rewrite the text to remove it. It's an incredible piece of evidence.
That one action speaks volumes about the systematic pressure he was under. Okay, what are the fourth inconsistency?
Inconsistency number 4, charm and emotion. The discussion in section 13, which is about the inappropriateness of charm and emotion in a pure judgment of taste, is a key conceptual component.
Right, because charm and emotion are examples of interest. They're things that please us for a reason, which the first moment says must be excluded.
Exactly. So logically, any discussion of excluding interests like charm and emotion should belong squarely under the first moment, which is disinterestedness and quality.
But it doesn't, does it?
Nope. The explicit definition of a pure judgment of taste, which refers back to being free from charm, appears much later under the third moment.
It's just weird.
It's structurally bizarre. It suggests that sections like 13 were part of an original flowing argument about defining the purity of the aesthetic feeling, which was then poorly integrated into the rigid four-part categorical scheme during the remodeling. The content just didn't map perfectly.
And finally, the most powerful systematic evidence of all. The fact that he completely fails to apply this beautiful structure anywhere else.
Inconsistency number 5, failure to apply the structure. For a writer who valued structural parallelism above almost everything else, Kant pays no systematic regard to the four-moment division outside of the analytic of the beautiful itself.
That is just baffling. He creates this perfect categorical four-part definition of beauty and then immediately ignores it for the rest of the book.
He does. Think about 2 key systematic failures here. First, he makes no attempt to show a parallelism between the characteristics of genius, which is the faculty that produces fine art, and the arrangement of the four moments, which is the faculty that judges art.
A truly systematic Kant would have absolutely demanded that structural link.
He would have. And second, and even more damning, is the antinomy.
Right.
The definitions of the beautiful given in the four moments are all paradoxes. They could all logically lead to an antinomy, a pair of contradictory but equally justifiable claims. So, a systematic writer would have been expected to exhibit 4 antinomies of taste, one for each moment.
But he doesn't do that.
He doesn't even try. When he writes the dialectic where the antinomy is, Kant only uses the 2 old logical peculiarities, universality and necessity, from the pre-remodeled deduction section. He completely ignores the new, perfectly mapped structure of the four moments.
That is definitive. If the four-moment structure was the original conceptual core, Kant would have used it consistently to structure the entire work, including the antinomy.
Or he would have.
The fact that he reverts back to the concepts of the old deduction proves that the four-moment mapping was an architectural overlay. It wasn't the foundational concept.
The evidence is just conclusive. The analytic of the beautiful is a remodeled room, designed to look symmetrical with the rest of the mansion, but the joints are showing.
Okay, so this philosophical detective work, it allows us to move beyond just pointing out the contradictions and to actually look for the original, untainted conceptual blueprint. The Critique of Taste as Kant first conceived it back in 1787.
We can start by noticing the structural imbalances and muted content that point us toward the nucleus of that original idea.
There's a clear lack of symmetry among the moments, right?
There is, particularly surrounding the third moment, finality apart from an end.
This is the moment that's universally regarded as containing the most novel and the most enduring insight of all of Kant's aesthetics.
It is the idea that beauty is experienced as purposive, yet without any definable purpose or goal. It's brilliant.
And our sources suggest that this third moment, along with the general exemplification that's found in section 14, contains the whole substance of the original exposition of taste before he did the remodeling.
The other three moments were necessary, systematic additions designed to fit the categorical table, but the third moment was the original philosophical breakthrough.
We also talked about the methodological mismatch between the different sections.
Yes, the psychological, almost observational method that Kant uses for analyzing the sublime, and also the laughable in section 54, is quite out of keeping with the analytic of the beautiful.
It feels like a different book.
It does. And since the analysis of the sublime likely remained pretty close to his 1764 anthropological approach, its retention in the final work suggests that the original manuscript was generally less rigorous and more flowing than the highly technical, four-part analytic of the beautiful ended up being.
Which brings us to the ultimate thought experiment here, reconstructing the original Critique of Taste. We can do this by mentally performing a surgical removal of all the late additions.
So we need to remove the scaffolding that was put up just to support the categorical structure. This means removing the explicit headings for the moments, the definitions, and all the sections that deal with disinterestedness, universality, and necessity that were inserted or amplified to create that four-part symmetry.
Okay, so specifically if you remove sections 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22, all the parts that really enforce that four-moment structure, how does the remaining text hold up?
It reads surprisingly natural.
Really?
The core sequential thought process, the argument about finality apart from an end, its purity, and the need for justification, the deduction, it wouldn't fail for want of anything that was proved in those removed sections.
Wow, so that powerfully validates the hypothesis. The philosophical core was functional on its own. The four moments were purely organizational.
And what's more, the general remark that appears at the end of the removed section 22, it's a summary that survived the reorganization, it would actually appear to be a more adequate summary of the preceding material in the simpler draft than it does in the final text.
It was a summary written for a different structure.
It was.
So the deeper implication here is that Kant's most profound insights into the nature of beauty were his original observations. And the complex four-part categorical structure he created was this brilliant but internally contradictory systematic device he used to force aesthetics into his established system of reason.
And if we take that surgical removal one step further, if we also remove sections 59 and 60,
the sections that explicitly make the link to the moral faculty, the ones that we think triggered the whole restructuring in the first place.
Exactly. If we take those out too, the resulting work is admittedly far less deep and worthy of the critical spirit of Kant. But, and this is critical, this simpler work presents decidedly fewer difficulties to his critics. It is philosophically simpler, it's less ambitious, and it's far more consistent.
So Kant chose systematic ambition over easy consistency.
He did. He wanted the third critique to be a bridge, and he was willing to make his aesthetic material work over time to fit the requirements of that grand architectural vision.
That is a fascinating conclusion. It really humanizes Kant. It shows him as a thinker who, even in his final great work, was wrestling with the internal inconsistencies of his own genius.
And prioritizing the coherence of his entire critical cosmos over the pristine elegance of any single component.
So what does this revelation of architectural struggle mean for you, the learner, as you approach the critique of judgment?
Well, I think it means you shouldn't view the four-moment structure as a set of four independent truths that Kant just discovered one by one.
Right.
But rather, you should see it as a framework he imposed to complete his systematic goal.
So the famous moments, which seem so foundational when you first read them, were likely the result of Kant looking backward at the moral faculty and at his pre-existing table of categories, and then retrospectively fitting his analysis of taste onto that table for systematic symmetry.
And this effort, this forcing it to fit, is what created the major inconsistencies and redundancies that you find throughout the deduction and the dialectic.
He was building the final bridge between the theoretical realm of nature and the practical realm of freedom.
He was. And the aesthetic judgment, being the only constitutive a priori principle linking these two worlds, needed to carry the entire systematic weight. The four moments provided the necessary scaffolding to make that connection look structurally sound.
This is Kant, the master system builder, choosing systemic duty over organic flow. If the most famous, most cited structure in all of aesthetic philosophy was really a late-stage organizational tool, a brilliant filing system, it raises a really powerful final question for you to consider.
When we look at modern art or new forms of media and we try to apply Kantian categories to judge their beauty or their quality, does the lasting truth of his analysis rest more firmly on the original, less structured insight?
That spontaneous, non-conceptual recognition of finality apart from an end.
Or does the final systematic arrangement, messy as it is internally, give us the necessary, robust intellectual tool to incorporate aesthetics into any complete theory of human reason, securing the critique of judgment's lasting power?
Is the content the ultimate value, or is it the architecture? Something to muse on next time you engage with a work of art and feel that sudden, strange satisfaction that Kant tried so very hard to categorize.
Thank you for diving deep with us today.